AMD every year at Congress hosts two major orations. AMD, for those of you who aren't aware, is about two-thirds of the college by number. We have approximately 16,000 members representing about 30 or more specialties. And I'm really proud that AMD has such a significant part of this Congress. And these two plenary orations represent a significant part of the college's history and a significant part of AMD's history. The first of these orations is the Priscilla Kincaid-Smith oration. Professor Kincaid-Smith was the first female president of RACP. Catherine, as we've heard a couple of times, is the third. Priscilla played a crucial role in the advancement of our profession in this part of the world. Priscilla was a nephrologist, and she forged a career in nephrology at a time when there were very few women practicing in medicine. With 3 children, she laid the groundwork for generations of female practitioners to come, illustrating that women could have a family and an extremely successful medical career. In addition to being the first female president of this college, she was the first professor of medicine at the University of Melbourne and the first female president of the World Medical Association. She was born in South Africa and graduated from medicine in 1950 before moving to Australia, where in the 60s she really developed her reputation for dramatic breakthroughs in medical practice when she demonstrated the causal link between compound analgesics and renal disease. She subsequently campaigned strongly and successfully against their use. She also made substantial contributions to research on the link between renal disease and hypertension. In 1975, she became a CBE for services to medicine and subsequently was recognised as a Companion of the Order of Australia, Australia's highest honour. The Priscilla Kincaid-Smith oration was established in recognition of the contribution that she made to medicine in this country and indeed to this college. It's been delivered every year since 1993 by an orator of international standing. Orators in the Priscilla Kincaid-Smith oration have generally been members of the adult medicine division. And I'm really pleased that today our orator is Professor Helena Teede. Helena is an endocrinologist from Monash in Melbourne. She's Executive Director of Monash Partners Academic Health Sciences Centre and led the establishment and currently chairs the Australian Health Research Alliance across the Advanced Health Research Translation Centres. Excuse me. She's also Director of the Monash Centre for Health Research and Implementation in the School of Public Health at Monash University. She's held leadership roles in healthcare research, translation, policy settings and in the not-for-profit sector. She sits on the NH and MRC Research Committee and is a member of the Academy of Health and Medical Research. Helena's passionate about partnership and stakeholder engagement and about research-informed healthcare improvement. She's developed and led women in medicine and women in leadership programs to engage and support women to advance their careers. Today's presentation is about women in medical leadership, and you'll understand the importance of that when it comes to our conference theme around disruption. Please join me in welcoming Helena.
Thank you very much. I'm very honoured to be invited to give this oration today. I remember when I first graduated, which I don't think was that long ago, there were actually very few female role models who were physicians, who were in specialty practice and who had a family and managed to develop a career. And Priscilla Kincaid-Smith at that time was one of them. So just first to note, I have no relevant disclosures of interest. So we've had a very eloquent introduction to Priscilla Kincaid-Smith and who she was, and it's a very appropriate opening to the talk I hope to engage you in today. She was obviously a dynamic leader at all levels, and yet she did so at a time where females in leadership were uncommon, and you can see there's a photo of her as the first female professor at Melbourne University, and I'm sure at the time that was a challenging environment to work in. We've heard of her great achievements, and these would have occurred at the time despite significantly greater challenges for women in leadership roles. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about women in medicine and leadership and just touch on some of the challenges and the inequities that exist. I'm going to indulge a little in a leadership journey only because it's scary how stereotypical that it actually is, and I'll talk about why. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges around models of leadership in the current day and the concept of power. Then the evidence around the barriers for women to progress in their careers, including traditional barriers and more recently very eloquently described barriers, which actually give us specific targets to be very constructive around overcoming them. Looking at some of the ways of moving forward and then bringing that back to some of the work that myself and some other leaders in Australia have been working on around building collaboration for disruption and impact. So this is actually a table from a paper that Grant was on, very appropriate, that was published recently about work done in Australia, and it was specifically engaging leaders in the healthcare sector and what they believed the key barriers were around women progressing in their career. And this specific table was actually looking at what the prevalence is of women in senior leadership roles in these organisations. So, beg your pardon? See if we can get this right. Yes. So if we look at hospitals, about 12.5% of our significant hospital CEOs are women. 78% of the workforce in hospitals is female. If you look at Australian Medical Association, it's about a fifth, medical schools, and we go down to the colleges in terms of prevalence of women in senior leadership roles. Now, traditionally, the argument's been that it's just a pipeline issue. As we all get old enough, we'll occupy these senior leadership roles. Before my time, women were at least 50% of the graduates. And it is fair to say that we are definitely not represented at 50% in senior leadership roles, despite many decades to have the opportunity to catch up. So there must be some factors in here that we can address as we move forward to improve this representation. So the glass ceiling is alive and well, because we know 50% of graduates in science, for example, are female and have been for many decades, yet only 17% of senior academics in medicine and science are female. In medicine, it's a little better in that 20 to 30% of leadership roles are occupied by women. But this has actually been static now for quite some time. The reality is also that the majority of house and family duties still fall to women, and in our recent survey of endocrine trainees within the college, and that survey will be expended soon, this is one of the major barriers for women for career progression, being able to juggle their duties at home, which they largely undertake as the primary caregiver in family and home situations. The equity agenda is important, and it's increasingly being realised that there's good evidence for having equity amongst leadership groups. And there's also evidence for having females as a balance in leadership roles. More importantly, there's no evidence on what the barriers are and what the effective steps forward are. And it's not a fight between men and women, and it's not necessarily a scenario where we repeatedly revisit the same challenges we've had for a long time, but more a scenario where we're now moving to specific evidence-based constructive ways we can help address that balance. So many women describe the fact that they've gone into their career and into what we call the leadership labyrinth. So there are many barriers and turns and dead ends along the way. And this experience in our research has been repeated. Most of the time, and not for everyone, but the majority of cases in Australia, this occurs in the early 30s. So our young women work as many hours, they train hard in medicine. When you think about how difficult it is to get into medical school in terms of dedication, talent, hard work, intellectual capacity and commitment, by the time you become a physician, you're a pretty extraordinary person. And yet we have these extraordinary people, and half of us are often able to go on to develop successful careers, but many of us are still disadvantaged. And one of the questions around that is how we address what those barriers are and move forward. And the workforce data, and I'll show this shortly, actually shows that women work just as hard and occupy similar positions until their early 30s. That directly coincides with early parenting. That doesn't mean that all women have children and it's the only barrier, but it does mean it's a very significant barrier, especially in physician training, because it comes often at the start of career development stage and at the end of training. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on my leadership journey, only because it has so many parallels with what the literature and evidence shows, so much so it was actually a bit annoying that I was stereotypical in some ways. So as a child, I travelled extensively because my father worked in electrical engineering, often overseas, and that gave me a very diverse exposure, which actually contributed to my resilience. And a lot of the people I've met along the way who've ended up in leadership roles are particularly resilient and have created a scenario where they can respond to adversity in a positive way. I note some of our trainees were talking about the need for resilience, and I think that's clearly very important. I had my typical training with medicine, did my FRACP, and worked as a general physician and in endocrinology. I have to say I really enjoyed my time working as a general physician and only stepped away from that when my husband became the head of department, and I thought that was probably a bit too close for comfort. I then went on to do a PhD, mainly as if I didn't have enough diversity, because I was seeking more career diversity, and found that extremely rewarding and offered me the opportunities to work both in academia and in health. But a critical part of my life, obviously, and my journey is my family. I married a respiratory intensivist who's an academic, and we are a busy family. We've had 2 children, but right from the very outset, we've had equal roles in parenting and caring for our children, and we've decided to have support at home. That has been fundamental to me being able to succeed in my career. And I'll share with you just a brief anecdote. I went to pick up my children at kinder when they were younger, and one of the mothers came up to me and said, "You are so lucky." I said, "Yes, but why?" She said, "Your husband does pick up and drop off at kinder." I said, "Yes, they're his daughters too, and we do the same job, and we share this." And she said, "My husband could never pick up and drop off the children." I said, "Why is that?" She said, "Oh, he's got far too much of an important job." I said, "What does he do?" She said, "He's an intensive care specialist." I said, "So's mine." Needless to say, her husband was a drop-off and pick-up subsequently. And came up to me and said, "I've got a bone to pick with you." I said, "I don't think so. You get to spend more quality time with your children. You can't blame me for that." But I suppose the point was that my husband, even though he's in intensive care, actually requested time to be able to be flexible and to be able to drop off and pick up the children on certain days. We had clinical days and admin, research and admin days that we moved around, and either of us were responsible if the children were sick. But that role-sharing partnership is not present for everyone, and in our case was particularly important, and also seems to be a feature for many women who do manage to succeed. It is challenging, it is rewarding. I have absolutely no regrets in my career or my family, and I find many young women feel guilty and feel they can't necessarily do one or the other. That was not me. And I think it's quite sad. I've recently interviewed some young women, more so in the US than Australia, in some of the international work I've been doing, and some of them are actively choosing not to have a family, primarily because they believe they can't have both a career and a family. And these are young physicians. And one of the things I think is that many of them have not had good role models. But help in managing the family and partnership is absolutely essential. So these are I have my permission, their permission, beg your pardon, to show you these, but these are my gorgeous young daughters. And when they were little, they were very dependent, obviously had very different challenges and need for flexible workplace. When they're older and they're going out looking like that, life becomes scary and things are more challenging in a different way. But the bottom line is that they do need your attention, and unlike a disappointing oration by a Harvard professor I attended many years ago, where her answer to managing family and career was longer hour childcare, my response to that is it's definitely not. And the evidence now shows absolutely unequivocally that flexibility in the workplace for parents, men and women, is actually the best way to allow women to promote to careers, especially when their children are young. So I am the archetypical, opportunistic, accidental leader, which the large majority of women are. Every role I have had, I have been tapped on the shoulder to take, with very few exceptions. I've actually had one job interview in my life. So in other words, mentors, others have said to me, you should really look at this role. And that is actually, for the vast majority of women, the way they are promoted into leadership roles. Very rarely do they go out and apply, and I'll come to the reasons for that. So I was headhunted into my academic and my clinical roles, and even into an exec MBA leadership program I did at a relatively young age, with a difficult 18-month-old and a 4-year-old, a clinical role and a research and academic career. I didn't want to go into this program, but it was, I was nominated, so I took it. I have to say, of everything in my career, that exec MBA program was the most useful and defining thing I've done in all my education. Importantly, it allows you to be objective about your self-awareness and strengths and weaknesses, and is a fundamental learning experience on how to lead others and how to manage yourself. On a personal level, you get to understand, if you do leadership training, what your motivators are and your drivers, where you get your energy, how you can manage your work-life balance, and understand that where you have autonomy, you can take a lot of demand, because stress is usually low control, high demand. But if you have a reasonable level of autonomy and a reasonable level of control, you can manage a very significant workload. I also recognised at a personal level that collaboration was very important to me, and that I primarily went to work to have influence and impact. I went on to do other leadership programs, including the Williamson Leadership Program, where I worked with many outside the health sector. And one of the things I realised in that, although I'm sure many in the room already know this, is that we are incredibly privileged to do what we do. So this Williamson Leadership Program was about recognised community leaders who had done great things for their community. And most people in there were very value-driven. But the large majority of them went to work to make shareholders wealthy, or to work for others around their own objectives, especially those in government. Often their objectives change day by day depending on ministerial whims at the time, and it was often very frustrating for them. But in medicine, we do have a lot of autonomy in our day-to-day interactions with our patients, and we do get to have impact and influence. One of the things that was defining in that training that I did was the concept of power. The facilitator pulled me aside at the end and said, Helena, you should really look at other opportunities in your career. I said, look, I'm quite happy doing what I'm doing. I'm a physician, I'm an academic, I'm a mother. I think I've got enough at the moment. He said, look, you really go to work to have influence and impact. I said, yes. He said, do you aspire to have power in your career? Can I ask the audience, if you raise your hand, whether you would aspire in your career to have power? Great. As usual, there's not many people who raise their hand, and I said, of course not. Because to me, power is defined as physical might or impact that was usually forced, political, authoritative control or influence. But when you actually redefine power, so usually we think of people like Donald Trump, of physical might. It was a very sad day when Donald Trump was elected, but I won't go into that. But the concept of moving from, the leader or the boss to the leader on the ground roots with the team. And the concept of influence through leadership was actually what the topic of that discussion on that day was, and it completely changed my attitude to my career. It was okay to aspire to leadership roles if your objective was influence and impact, collaboration and working and mentoring with others. And that was very much aligned with my personal value set. And indeed, in the evidence, it shows that it's very much aligned with many women who seek leadership roles. They don't necessarily seek authoritative control, but if that's the only role models they see, they don't necessarily aspire to that. So that as we see more and more that leadership is based on inspiration, not domination, on cooperation, not intimidation, we see in those environments many more women escalate into leadership roles. And indeed, from that point onwards, I took a completely different attitude to the work that I did. The other thing to remember in behavioural genetics that shows that only 30% of variation in leadership is actually inherited. The rest is mainly your role models, early opportunities for leadership development, understanding how leadership might sit with your personal values. And the other thing to note is that homogeneous teams don't make better decisions, they just think they do. So I went on to my roles, mother, partner, clinician, academic, but then I took on a range of leadership roles. That included, as the head of unit, for a long time I was the only female head of unit in my specialty. I took on the presidency of first clinical female president of the Endocrine Society of Australia, and then on to international societies. I head up an academic health science centre, and as I said, I've had numerous other roles. Each time I've taken on a role, I've very carefully analysed what I can achieve in that role over the time that I'm there, what will be my influence and impact. And I've had great satisfaction from those roles for that reason. But one of the most satisfying things has been training and mentoring the next generation, especially women, with a range of leadership courses and quite a large range of organisational initiatives. I had the pleasure of doing a podcast with Catherine Yellen, we were just talking about that before, which is an RACP initiative, and I looked recently and it had been downloaded and listened to over 7,000 times, and I'd encourage you, there's a lot of fantastic women on there, to have a listen if you have time. But essentially I realised that leadership for me was about the motivation for influence and impact, not ever personal control and authority. So if we just come to, and in fact that's as I said, the evidence shows that's very much how women would relate to leadership. So if we look at some of the barriers, and I'm going to go back to that article I mentioned that Grant was involved in because it's one of the best I find in the literature. So this was an Australian study on looking for reasons and remedies of underrepresentation for women in leadership. So the argument, as I said, that maybe it's all a pipeline issue. As women get older, they'll come naturally into leadership roles. As I've mentioned, this is no longer valid. Progress is much slower than we see, and indeed in leadership settings, it's often been largely static over the past decade. I remember a recent conversation when we were doing our central interview panels for our advanced trainees coming into endocrinology, and in my field, the vast majority of applicants are women. It's around 80%. So every year, the applicants would come in and be interviewed by 13 males and myself, and I was always put closer to the applicant because I was less intimidating and they may be able to relate to me a little better. I'm pleased to say there are now 4 females in the room, which is terrific. But as these women came in and did their interviews, many of them are now having challenges with having children and maternity leave. And at the end of the day, over a glass of wine, when we were, myself and my fantastic, very well-respected 13 male colleagues were chatting, it came up that there was a challenge because we now had so many females in this area, and how were we going to manage? Because none of them really wanted to work too hard, and they all wanted to work part-time and have their families, and they didn't want significant leadership roles in the hospital. And so the diatribe went on. And I put up my hand and I said, I'm here, I'm in the room. And they said, well, you don't count. I said, why don't I count? I've had a family, I've worked part-time, I've built my career, I've done all these things that you're talking about, but I only had a small downtime when my children were in early, before school essentially, which is what the evidence shows women take in terms of hours off work. But the difference was I had a spectacular mentor who allowed me flexibility and mentored me to maintain my career strategically whilst I was working part-time. And I said, what sort of roles are you offering these young women? And the sorts of roles had no flexibility. They had no opportunity to do that downtime and to juxtapose or dovetail young families and career. And so I said to them at the time, I work in women's health, in reproductive women's health. I now have a team of 140, and because of the nature of what I do, the vast majority of my team are female. But within my team, I have 10 independently funded clinical NHMRC research fellows, which is very, very hard to achieve, and have 3 presidents of national societies. They didn't get there because they're necessarily any more spectacular than many other young women, but they got there because they had that dovetail flexibility, career development opportunity at a critical stage. And so we went on then to talk about reframing the positions that the hospitals were offering these young women as they were coming out of training, and had many conversations and changed some of those roles subsequently. But it was really not, it was an unconscious bias, a complaint about what was happening, but without understanding the reason. So the pipeline is really no longer valid, and we really need to do more about this. There is a concern that maybe women are not interested in leadership roles. Very appropriate, and neither are some of our male colleagues, but if they are, they need to be fostered. And there are even those that suggest we don't have the natural talent for it. I'm not even really going to address that one. So out of this article, and the reason I find this article really useful is there were 3 key themes that came out. And when I'm working with young women, I find these really useful because they and their mentors, both male and female, can relate to them. One of the biggest barriers for women is capacity. We do juggle a lot, and we juggle it at a critical time in terms of career development, but there are strategies that can be used to manage it. And so one of the critical things about this, and this is now the #1 factor in organisations that are successful in promoting women into leadership roles. It's not quotas, it's not we must have 40% or 50%. It's actually whether they have workplace flexibility for men and women during the early parenting years and beyond. And that is the #1 most effective policy. I find you get far more discretionary effort, and I'm sure everyone in my team works more hours than they're actually paid for, but they have flexibility. Likewise, during my career, when I was approached about my leadership role, and originally I declined it, they came back and offered it again and said, what would it take for you to do it? And I said, I want a corporate salaried, spectacular PA. Not a hospital secretary, I'll take a cut in salary, but this is what I need to make my life work. And I can tell you in my diary in the morning, it says, bring mum clothes to work. And in my diary it says travel time. I think officially recently it was reflected that I'm the only mother who made it to every athletics and every swimming carnival at my daughter's school. and yet I think I'm probably one of the busiest. But I had spectacular help and support and a really flexible workplace to be able to do that, and I had to be really organised. The other thing about capacity is getting help. Many young women feel guilty about getting help, and guilt is actually one of the biggest barriers when they have young families, and having mentors that recognise that and support them and advise them to get help is important. And that's not necessarily help looking after the children, which is something they often prefer to do, but help doing other things. I proudly have never ironed any item of clothing that belongs to my children, and they don't care. So the other thing is, if we think about power, this is just a brief anecdote. If you think about power in a physics sense, it is actually work divided by time, and I'd challenge you that women are probably exceptionally good and very powerful if we think about power in this context with what they juggle. So what about the work hours? So as I mentioned before, women tend to work about the same hours roughly until they actually, and this is the medical workforce data, until they're in the early parenting years. They drop down quite dramatically, but that drop, if you look at it in detail, and I've now looked at it internationally, is specifically preschool years. After that, they tend to increase their working hours, and the more recent data I've seen, which is not unfortunately in graph form, actually shows they pick their hours up a lot more than this once the children get to school, as long as they've got flexibility in the workplace. The hours and contribution they make are directly proportional to whether or not they've got flexibility. Over their career, though, you can see that they work even, and this was 2009 data, they work still a fairly significant number of hours compared to our male colleagues. So we've talked about capacity and some of the ways we can address that. The other issue is capability, which is expertise, initiative, innovation, execution. Do we really honestly think women are not as good as these things as men are? The challenge for capability for women is not actually capability, it's confidence in their capability. So the evidence shows that women are far less likely to apply for a promotion. They're extremely less likely to ask for a pay rise. And I have to say that I was quite taken aback when I went to meet with my dean recently for my performance appraisal. And at the end, she put her head on one side and said, "Helena, you really need to ask me for a pay rise." And I went, "I'm on a standard level-y university salary. I didn't know you could get a pay rise." And she just laughed and she said, "Every one of your male colleagues, every year without exception, tries to negotiate a pay rise. And it's never even occurred to you." And I knew once again I was probably being guilty of self-advocacy, but again, I negotiated something I wanted that wasn't a pay rise, but it was very important to me to be able to run my team. But I suppose I'm making that point because self-confidence is a critical thing. We know that women do not, in general, apply for a role until they tick all 10 criteria. In general, men will apply when they tick 5. So that's not a bad thing for men, but it is for women, and we need to look and be much more focused on mentoring them. Women are more likely to apply for a leadership role, even if it's a small leadership role, if they have a senior male or female mentor who taps them on the shoulder and says, "Think about this, you could do it." And that's one of the things we don't tend to do. So getting women to believe in their skills and ability is really important here, and supporting others more junior to us, both as male and female leaders, to believe in their own skills and ability is really important. Mentors are critical in this, and I'm sure many in the audience know the difference between a mentor and a supervisor, but a mentor is primarily there to advise and to support the individual. In the case of women, this is exceptionally important, and again, the evidence shows that. The idea of throwing down a rope for the people behind you is important, but one of the women honoured this year at the Women in Leadership Awards actually said, "Look, we need to stop stuffing around with throwing ropes down for women behind us. Things are just far too slow. We actually need to throw a net down, and we all need to be throwing that net down to help as many up as we can." The other one, so we've talked about capacity, we've talked about capability. The other one that came out in this really great piece of research was credibility. So credibility is the quality of being convincing, believable, trustworthy. And it is resulting from expertise and experience, but it's also being similar and credible amongst your peers. So you can imagine that Priscilla Kincaid-Smith, when she took on her leadership role, and she took on many of them, and she was usually in the minority as a woman. How much credibility do you think she had as a leader when she first entered those roles? And there's been many times myself and many other young women have found ourselves in situations where we do not feel we have the credibility because we do not look the same or even behave the same necessarily as many others in the room. So one of the strategies that we've been using in the organisations I work with is to make sure when we are promoting women in leadership roles, especially young women, we're not necessarily doing it in isolation. The same way when we engage consumers in healthcare improvement or in research, we don't put one of them in the room, we put two of them in the room, so that they're actually not necessarily the person who's alone. And that's actually been a really important strategy in terms of their confidence. So credibility is not really about whether women have credibility to lead, but actually whether they fit the current stereotype and role model. And so one of the biggest barriers I personally had when I started in my leadership roles was I personally find appalling behaviour really difficult. And I had many colleagues, and they were senior at that time, and I'm not saying women don't behave badly in the workplace, but all the leaders who were at that time were males. And it got to the point where I actually very politely stood up and left a meeting when I had two white-knuckled, very senior physicians screaming at each other across the table and a group of quite distressed young women in the room. Now, unfortunately, that sort of behaviour occurs less and less, and we see it less and less. But one of the things that was important was actually to call it. And then I went back and had a meeting with each of them about the experience that the women and young males in the room had of that sort of behaviour amongst leaders. And it may have been acceptable in the past, but it's definitely not acceptable now. But rarely do people stand up and call it. I thought it was going to be the end of my career, to be honest, but it actually was not. And as I've gone on, I've become braver and braver. I don't behave badly in objecting to that sort of behaviour, but the issue is if we see behaviour that is intimidating and that is threatening, both for young women and young men, it's important as leaders to step up and to address that. And actually we've now got a whole range of strategies, such as a behaviour checker in meetings, who make sure that people chair appropriately, respect the chair, listen to others, and that everybody has an opportunity. That may sound reasonably lame, but it has completely changed the way our meetings run in what is the largest healthcare organisation. And it has actually been very interesting because those who were very badly behaved, wish to control and talk over the top of others, no longer come to the meetings, which are now much more productive. So think about whether or not the environment that the women are coming into actually allow them to be a credible leader. Aiming for balance and representation is important. Strategies to enable a conducive environment for women to move into leadership. Not just women, but early and mid-careers as well. So this is a McKinsey report I mentioned, and the key factors for success are a strong case and recognition for the need for change, redesigning roles and training, and as I said, the number one strategy is about flexible workplace and normalising flexible work. You can do it. I have 5 registrars in our training program. Last year, 3 out of 5 of them had maternity leave. Now, yes, it was challenging. We didn't quite imagine we were going to have 3, but we managed to do it, and several of them are now back in part-time roles this year to complete their training. They recently reflected that not at any stage during telling us about their maternity leave, working out their plans, working out how they were going to finalise their training, had they been made to feel guilty or uncomfortable about the fact that they were going to take maternity leave. And they have had a flexible work environment around that, but it's not necessarily the experience of others. Supporting talent through the life transitions, dovetailing career and family, as I said, providing infrastructure to support an inclusive and flexible workplace, role modelling commitment to diversity, and setting up aspirations and goals and being brave. There is opportunities for the College for Leadership here, and there is a group who are working around this, and I would strongly encourage that there's a lot we can do. Setting aspirational goals, as I said, developing rising women, challenging traditional views of merit and credibility when we recruit and we evaluate, and actively sponsoring women who are interested. There are many initiatives in the academic sector, and I can tell you that the academic sector is often even much more competitive. The successful academic is often a winner who has been highly competitive and is very successful at it, and that's a very difficult environment for many women. The NHMRC has a range of initiatives. They have made some substantive changes recently, but there is quite a long way to go in terms of equity. The Athena Swan initiative throughout universities could have a lot of relevance to the clinical context, and there are a number of other opportunities, including for groups like the college. So these were some of the recommendations, again, that came out of the research that I referred to in Leadership in Women in Australia, to recognise unconscious gender bias. I used to think it wasn't there, but more and more I realise it is. I recently left, as I said, the presidency of the Endocrine Society of Australia, and the very next meeting we had, I looked at the program, and the program was 14 male speakers and 2 female speakers on the last session of the last day. And it was profoundly disappointing. I then rang up the then president and said, can we please actually put this into policy that we do want to consider gender balance when we're looking at the speakers on our program. I thought we'd move beyond having to do that. But there is just an unconscious recognition of gender bias. And there are many examples of where that can play out. And what that looked like to the young females in the audience is our role models and our successful endocrinologists are only males. And interviewing them after and reflecting on what that said to them didn't say that the males weren't fantastic and should have had the right to speak as experts, but there's no way that balance actually represented reality. To support and encourage women through those periods of maternity leave, I keep coming back to that, but that's the critical thing in leadership, and promote women for consideration of leadership roles, to be flexible, to improve reporting and consideration at senior levels. That includes through to groups like the Adult Medical Council, helping to develop training and career pathways, and encouraging women to look at their opportunities. So just very finally, I'm going to talk about the relevant subject we've come together around this Congress, which is how women in leadership are relevant for impact. So if we want to manage complex change, and getting women into leadership roles is complex, we need vision, skills, incentives, resources, and action plan. And I can tell you almost nobody puts all those together for this purpose. In fact, so we often end up with confusion, anxiety, frustration, emotive outbursts, which do us no value at all, and actually probably a disservice, and frustration, rather than actually delivering impact and change. So if we have all those things, and it's important to recognise this does not happen without resource, then we are able to enable and support young women and to increase women in leadership roles, to identify and address unconscious bias, and to disrupt the norms. So in a way, disruption actually is important to be able to get women into leadership roles and create a level playing field. But actually, why do we want to? Maybe women don't need to be in leadership roles. Maybe things are fine just the way they are. So I'll just challenge that a little bit again with some of the literature from some of the evidence that's available. So we know that equity delivers more inclusive style of leadership. There is greater collaboration and cooperation when you have a more diverse team. A meta-analysis on women in leadership showed that women actually are more transformational leaders than men because they are often more likely to listen to a more diverse group of stakeholders and to take on more diverse opinions. They're not necessarily better, and in fact, in times of significant tough leadership is required, often males are more successful at reaching targets. But where you're looking for transformation and change, female leaders bring particular skills and qualities to the table. They often manifest leadership styles that relate more to effectiveness because they're more about the individuals that work with them and engaging for the common goal. Whilst this is generalised, the bottom line is we need both men and women in leadership roles. We need diversity, we need early, mid-careers, people from different ethnic backgrounds, because that makes for the best leadership teams and the best outcomes. We have greater success in attaining goals and greater promotion of collaboration. Collaboration is fundamental for transformation. So what opportunities do we have in the healthcare system? Currently, we're very siloed. Our state and our federal and our private sources actually fund our health system and often cause duplication and compete with each other. And this leads to scenarios where we as clinicians cannot provide the best care for our patients because we often can't get a continuous stream of integrated care, leading to a situation where we have a burning platform. I'm going to talk more about this when I talk about the disruptive forces with Don Campbell and others later today. But just to say that we have the same similar problems in research. There's a very naive concept that in research a microbiologist sits over here with a pipette, decides what research is important to clinicians and the community, and voila, 17 years later we have all the answers. Needless to say, perhaps the questions from the physicians and the community needed to be back here, and this needed to be an iterative process, but at the current time, this is the international model for research. It's not collaborative and it's not iterative, and it needs to change. And that's one of the reasons why our research doesn't necessarily translate into practice, because it doesn't answer the problems that our clinicians have. So one of the things about this is that to drive disruption and improvement, we need to bring everyone together, and we need to collaborate and stop competing, especially always competing in research. One of the ways to do that is to integrate research, education and practice, which is what's currently happening through creating communities of practice where people can come and work together. Clinician leadership alongside academia and alongside community without necessarily a sense of superiority or competition. So the model in Australia is that research and education will sit within health, and our academic health science centres are set up as health service-led entities. All of you, with the exception of Tasmania, now have these in your states, and they are now funded. The minister's in the process of announcing progressively a total of $65 million to these centres across the country. And they are funding us because we are collaborating and working together, and because of the ethos that this is about integration and healthcare improvement. I lead one of these entities. It's the toughest but most rewarding job I've ever had. I come home and pull the knives out of my back from all the competitive people who just want the money, as opposed to the people who collaborate and want to work together. And the leadership group for this, both internally and nationally, is very much a diverse mix that bring many different skills to the table. I think if I resign from or finish my career tomorrow, I think one of the best and proudest opportunities I would have to reflect, besides my wonderful family, is that I brought all these academic health science centres together into a national alliance. There is so much our country of 25 million people need to do together, not necessarily need to do apart. We need one national data sharing accord. We need one clinical trial platform, and yet we have jurisdictions, we have competition, duplication, and really it doesn't help us care for our patients at all. In Australia, the community is the funder and the beneficiary of healthcare and research. They deserve them to be integrated, they deserve this to be collaborative. And the conversations to bring these competitive groups together originally was very challenging, but has really changed dramatically. We've had unprecedented engagement, a lot more collaboration, and the premise is that Australians should expect their taxpayers' dollars to be working together constructively. The interesting thing is the Health Department recently reflected that this initiative is actually reflective of socialisation of health and research, and that really anybody who's into healthcare improvement should be sharing that. If Catherine has the best clinical service in the country, then everybody has the right to access that and not be competitive around it. So this has actually been a really great platform to have diverse leadership. As I mentioned, there's a number of national initiatives now around data-driven healthcare improvement and a range of other areas where we're working collaboratively together. Ultimately, the opportunity to have impact and influence was the main driver, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, and indeed is the main driver, based on evidence, for women to go into leadership positions. So thank you very much for the opportunity to reflect on my career and the similarities and parallels it has for many women in leadership roles. I'll leave you with just a few thoughts from Hilary Clinton when she was in Australia just in the last few days. Always aim high, work hard, and care deeply about what you believe in. And when you stumble and when you get knocked down, as she has quite spectacularly, get right back up and never listen to anyone who says you can't or you shouldn't go on. And I just leave you with those thoughts because so often we need to remember to tell that to our younger generation, be they male or female, but especially women during their early career development stages when they're involved in early parenting. Thank you.
Helena, thank you so much. I was really determined that AMD sponsor a conversation about women in medical leadership at this Congress, partly to honour Priscilla Kincaid-Smith, who was one of our great leaders, full stop, happened to be a great female leader, but partly because this is a conversation that I believe we have to have as a college if we're to remain contemporary and relevant in a rapidly changing world. And I'm sure you'll all agree with me that Helena's been more than up to the task of bringing this really important issue to us in a really meaningful way. So Helena, it gives me very great pleasure to award you the medal for the Priscilla Kincaid-Smith Oration. Thank you.